shadowy flight into the dangerous world of a man who does not exist. Michael Knight, a young loner on a crusade to champion the cause of the innocent, the helpless, the powerless, in a world of criminals who operate above the law.
Everybody, and welcome once again to GeekFest Rants. My name is Carlos Perron, and joining me today I have James. Say hello, James.
Hello, hello.
Well, today we are going to take a kind of like a wide look at the career of a gentleman who recently passed away called Glen Larson. And that should be a name that anybody, not only a genre person like ourselves, but just a regular 70s and 80s television watchers should recognize, because this is a name that is associated with so many shows that we might have seen and you might have seen. And in a way, it kind of reminds me of some other past, executive producers and show creators from the 70s and even before, that when you start looking at the resume, it is just kind of ridiculous how many shows these people either came up with completely on their own or participated in. James, can you compare him to anybody else that we might recognize?
I think Glen Larson was one of the biggest TV producers, especially in the types of shows we like and our era of television. But I think he would be up there with Stephen J. Cannell, Donald Belisario, and even somebody like Jack Webb, because of the types of shows that they put out and the impact that they made. These weren't shows that just kind of came and went. They had a lot of lasting impact on people and have even come back around now to be remade and to be still loved by people like us, people our age group who watched a lot of television, obviously, in the 70s and the 80s, but even just new younger people like their style of television. It was intriguing, but it was kind of easy to access. You didn't have to have a lot of backstory if you jumped into one of those episodes, or if you loved it from the beginning, that was good too.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you hit the big ones that are genre related, at least for us, and we've done some of these shows already, and we mentioned his name before. The easiest one for me is Battlestar Galactica. We've done a couple of shows on Battlestar, actually.
Yeah.
It's amazing the fact that this guy, it was almost like, he's like the go-to guy for a certain time period where the man is just pumping out shows like they're going out of style. And don't get me wrong, some of these shows we love and some of these shows are completely god-awful. But the big hits, the big names that people might recognize are something like a Battlestar, something like Magnum P.I., even something that's even non-genre for us, which is Quincy.
He was involved in $6 Million Man, and
I mean that you can't get more genre than that.
Buck. Did you say Buck Rogers? Did you?
Buck Rogers. That's right.
I mean, it's impressive the stuff that he was involved with. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge, as a TV producer, his job was to make entertainment that the people wanted for a TV price, kind of, or for
right,
to be fit into the TV box. And I don't just mean the machine. I mean the type of actors who the audience can
right,
and they can afford, and things like that. So he had a way of taking things or representing things that were big, maybe even big in the movies or in some other media, and then putting them on television, and selling them. And they did sell. They did very well.
Right. And the thing to also keep in mind is that similar to some of our most famous showrunners these days, let's say, and somebody even like a J.J. Abrams, who now is more of a film director, but his claim to fame was, something like Lost. And admittedly, for him, it was more of a situation where he would start a show, create it, and then let it run on its own. And this is something that I'm hearing that Larson used to do also, is that he would be very instrumental in the creation and the putting together of whatever the heck the show is. And then once the show was running the way I guess he liked it to run, he would kind of give it off to the people in charge and move on to something else. And I guess that's what would allow him to be able to hop from one show to the other and to the other in such a, determined amount of time. Because if you think about it, all the shows he's done, it spans years and they all kind of overlap each other during that time frame.
Yeah. The biggest ones we said that I think we liked were probably Battlestar and Buck Rogers. Now, of the stuff that he was also involved with $6 Million Man and Magnum, I don't know if you like Magnum as much. I think we've talked about that recently. You need somebody to have that kind of vision. And we always talk about how, like the showrunner or we seem to talk about that phrase more. That's more of a modern phrase. But that's basically like what he was. He'd get the ball off the ground, like you said, and then hire people. And sometimes it would be good people, and sometimes, it'd be failures. I guess it just depends on the, on the show. Mm-hmm. So, I don't have a problem with the guy. I think, I knew the name. I always knew his name. I knew if a show that he was making came out, generally I'd at least check it out, and it had some entertainment value or people that I knew that I liked. Fall Guy. I love $6 Million Man. So Fall Guy comes out, and, I was pretty excited, that.
Now, what was that? Just to remind people, what was the premise of Fall Guy? He was a bounty hunter?
Fall Guy was a bounty hunter. Not a bounty hunter like Steve McQueen in the movie The Hunter. He was more like he was a stunt man who moonlighted as a bounty hunter, or vice versa. And he had two sidekicks. A guy, slightly goofy, handsome guy, and a hot girl. I think it was Heather Thomas. And
well, you got to have a hot girl, no matter what.
And it was like they were the team, and they'd get mixed up, or in some kind of adventure, or blah blah blah.
And it's funny because it's a way in a way, it's kind of like the old fans of $6 Million Man. Here's a way to kind of reignite, and it did for a while, Lee Majors' career.
Yeah, well, the $6 Million Man had just recently ended, and he was still a good-looking, handsome guy. People that's the thing about television. People are loyal, and Larson kind of knew that too, because he used a lot of the people over again. It's the same thing now. Magnum P.I. was a show in the 80s, and now there's a show with Tom Selleck. I don't know how good it is. I guess it depends on your point of view, but it's a cop show.
Blue Bloods, I think it's called, yeah.
Yeah, and I know people really like it because now it's an older Tom Selleck. He's pushing 70, but it's still, the people are loyal. They don't go away unless that person became a jerk in some way or quit the show that they loved or was disrespectful. So in that respect, Larson knew what he was doing. As a producer, that's what a producer has to do. And he took properties, or was presented with properties, to try to say, hey, this is big in the movies. Star Wars is huge. Do you have anything like Star Wars? Yeah, I have this. I've been working on it. Turns out it's Battlestar Galactica. Okay. Smokey and the Bandit's huge. What do you got? Oh, well, we've got BJ and the Bear. Those kind of movies.
Right.
Buck Rogers is Buck Rogers, another space show. They wanted to keep going with that.
And that is something, let's mention this, and we talked about it in the past briefly, is the fact that while that is perfectly somewhat legal to do, it has gotten him in hot water, through his career. There are times where he was sued, or the studio that he worked for would be sued for something like that. And the best example we can come up with is the Lucas Battlestar Galactica lawsuit that I think ended up going nowhere. But it just, again, like you mentioned, the fact that, the timing was so precise that, we're coming off Star Wars. Battlestar is using Star Wars' resource special effects company, sometimes on the down low.
Yeah, well, that's where it got tricky, because they did share intellectual idea. It wouldn't be intellectual properties, but it was the
technology.
Idea is, well, we've got these same people who produce the special effects for Star Wars. Great, let's use them. Oh, they happened to mention they were working on something involving snow for the next Star
the
Wars
snow planet.
Wow,
Yeah.
Really? We can write a snow story. So it's kind of like, I'm sure there was like, hey, screw them. We're going to do it too. And we're going to do it quicker because we're television and we can make it faster. And yeah, I mean, there's an element of, unseemliness.
You could kind of see it from both perspectives. You could see how Lucas would be pissed that, he's trying to keep his movie under wraps that's about to come out in a year or so. And somebody beats them to the punch, with something similar.
What's different from that today when you have the Twilight movies with vampires that are hot, very hot, and then they have suddenly the Vampire Diaries on on television, or the Avengers and Iron Man and all these superhero movies are amazingly huge, and then somebody says, oh, well, let's bring the Flash back, or let's do something, with Gotham, or, I'm not talking about even the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. That's part of the same series.
It's a trend. It's a trend.
Yeah, it's like, oh, well, we've got this guy too, or we've got this story, or we've got this actor under contract, so let's use him in a style that people like or are familiar with.
Right. Now, let's also mention, while we're on the genre subject, we're going to talk about the other shows a little bit also, but another big genre show that we actually never done a show about is Knight Rider.
Yeah, and it's funny. I wasn't a Knight Rider guy. I mean, I know it. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows, David Hasselhoff and Kit, and it just wasn't my thing for some reason. It was around the era that I would have been watching a lot of television. But I know my brother, maybe you got into it, I don't know. But I didn't jump into it. But, it wasn't terrible.
Right. I mean, to me, it was almost kind of like the A-Team. It's one of these shows that it's there and you might as well watch it. It theoretically has a sci-fi element to it because the car is so futuristic and full of gadgets. It's almost like a Bond car if you think about it. But because it's TV, they don't have to go completely nuts with special effects. It's more of driving effects, the type of effects you might see on Chips or any other show at the time where, the car jumps and it flies and it goes on two wheels, it shoots stuff, To
me, it came across more like a cartoon. And I know any of the shows that we've talked about today, and most of our shows could be cartoonish, but that one in particular, I think that's why I didn't embrace it as much. But, another one that was all in all cartoon was BJ and the Bear and Sheriff Lobo. And I just want to mention, since they're his shows, because we're never going to do them on their own, I don't think, unless...
I don't think so. Here's your chance.
BJ and the Bear was kind of like, the handsome Burt Reynolds type. And I just remember, I know I've mentioned this before. It's like, oh, and this week BJ mixes it up with the lady truckers. It's like, and that was an excuse to get like, Adrian Barbeau or somebody like that.
Was it the economy Burt Reynolds?
Yeah, and that was, but the Sheriff Lobo one, okay, that kind of piggybacked on.
Was that a little bit of Dukes of Hazzard?
That was a little bit about Sheriff Justice and a little bit of Dukes of Hazzard, exactly. Which Dukes of Hazzard itself was a little bit of Smokey and the Bandit.
Yeah, but the thing about Sheriff Lobo, I think, is that it kind of hops on this. And again, I'm telling you, I remember the shows because I remember the names, but I never watched them religiously.
All right,
but I watched enough to get a little bit.
Let me just tell you.
Hold on. Let me just say something here that he also has a history of, the country detectives and the Southern cop, when it comes to something like McCloud.
Yeah, well, Claude Akins was an older actor, not really a comedic actor, although he did have some, roles like that. But this is like a guy who you take serious. You look at him, he looks like he means business. And just from the start of the show, the theme, it's, the serious sounding, militaristic sounding guy. He walks in all proud, a lawman. And then the ridiculousness. There's no way you guys could see it unless we provide you with a link. But most people have not seen that show because it was, late 70s, early 80s. But,
and he had his own bumbling sidekick and everything.
It's just the theme is so great. And the visuals of the theme, somehow, I hope you guys can get to see it. And
I'll put as many link show openings as I can think of.
Yeah, that's the kind of fun stuff, and that was before A-Team. That was before some of that
right.
Other...
We're talking we're talking closer to the early '80s, late '70s. Like I mentioned, shows like McCloud, which nowadays nobody has the slightest clue. You have to go to like the TV Land or one of all these show channels to watch all the repeats of these shows. But let's not forget,
McCloud is like another one. It's almost like an adaptation, or shall we say rip-off of Coogan's Bluff with Clint Eastwood. You know what I'm saying?
Well, it's the cop who comes to the city, the southern cop comes north, and the fish out of water type of thing.
And it's still good. I'm not putting any of them down. I kind of, look, Get Christy Love, all these shows. That was probably a blaxploitation kind of, a Pam Grier kind of rip-off.
Let's not forget that as much genre material that he's done, let's talk about, I could think of two genre vehicles that he did that were complete flops.
All right, well, let me just, right off the bat, Manimal. Okay. Now, I recently read a story about Manimal. It was like,
let's describe Manimal to people first.
All right, it's a doctor, very handsome, doctor.
Of course.
And he has this ability to turn into an animal to help solve crimes, which, hey, we got a lot of crime, we need a guy who can help it.
I'm all over that.
But the trouble is, after a while, you could kind of tell. I mean, look, Stan Winston was the guy who helped create the effects that made it's almost like early morphing type of thing.
And that's before he was a big shot.
Yeah, I mean, so we're not talking about chumps. There are people who wound up having unbelievable Oscar-winning careers involved in this show. But it just was such a premise that was a little corny, and then after a while you could just kind of tell they gave up, and he kept turning into like the same animal or something like that. But hey, William Conrad had narrated, so it was very impressive, a nice, very impressive voiceover each time.
And the other one was Ottoman. Now, what can you tell us about Ottoman?
Well, I can tell you it was a ripoff of Tron.
Now, was this show an actual show about the thing you put your feet on while you watch TV?
This is a tribute, so I want to say, let's say it's an homage to Tron, and it didn't last very long. And I mean, at the time, Tron wasn't it was a groundbreaker and people liked it, but it wasn't, there wasn't a demand for more, for TV Tron.
I remember that the sidekick of the show, the human sidekick, was Desi Arnaz.
I was going to say Little Ricky. It's not
Desi
really Little Ricky.
Or one of the
Desi.
The little Desi, that's who he was. He was the psychic. And again, the only thing I remember of the show, other than the fact that there was a ripoff of Tron, was that whenever the car would make a left turn, it would be a complete 90-degree turn. So whoever was in the car driving or next to Ottoman would completely slam against the window because the centrifugal force of making such a sharp turn would just slam the person against the wall.
But that was because they were trying to be like the light cycles and things like that from Tron. So I mean, I understand. I don't want to turn this loving tribute into into making fun of it. But
no, we're talking about the hits and the misses.
Yeah, there was an element of cheesiness in the misses for sure. And that was one of them. I mean, if you love Tron, you might like the TV show, but I don't think it would have lasted.
The other thing I want to mention is the fact that when you're dealing with the more serious shows, the Quincy's, for example, a coroner cop show, if you will, a procedural type of a show.
That was almost, Quincy was kind of like canon or, some of the.
Right, it was a more serious thing.
That was an NBC carryover of all those CBS cop dramas, NBC,
right. And even
NBC said, hey, we need something. And Quincy turned out to be, like a huge show.
Right. But I'm saying even a show like Magnum was a more of a straight copy detective type of action show. And those are the highlights of the more serious shows. But let's remember also he had a couple of flops, and I remember them very well. There was
Galactica
one
1980? Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm not even getting to that, but I'm talking about something like, for example, a show called Masquerade, I remember.
Oh, well,
which was like an undercover type of a secret agent.
It's funny you mentioned that as a flop because I kind of remember it, and I kind of remember liking it. And I think part of the reason I did like it was because it had Kirstie Alley in it, and this was right after Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan.
Right,
and
it was pre-Cheers.
Of course, Greg Evigan's back on it because he's BJ from BJ and the Bear, so why not? But it had kind of like, kind of like the Spy. It was like a James Bond-ish kind of.
And who was the star that I kept forgetting his name?
It was Rod Taylor.
There we go. He's a famous actor.
And the funny thing is, it wasn't awful. It had enough spy. Remember, I think it was the JJ. Was it a JJ show? I'm not even sure. Was it with Jennifer Garner? Was it Alias or something like that?
Yeah, Alias, yes.
Is that his show? So you could almost say it had elements of Alias in it way before Alias. And it's just a little lighter, though. It was a little lighter in style. And so much for that. That's another one I'd like to see on MeTV or something.
Yeah, now in that vein, you also had Cover Up, if you remember Cover Up.
Cover Up now, that was, I think, he was a model.
They were all
something.
models. There was like a modeling agency, but they're really CIA agents or something.
But the sad part of that, and that show, it basically had to end. They tried to save it, but the main actor, a very handsome guy named John Eric Hexum, and it turned out, everybody thinks when you talk about a fake gun, there's no such thing as a fake gun or a prop gun. The gun is still loaded with something. It just doesn't have a projectile in it. But sadly, the explosive that they use to make the flash ejects, force. And the guy was playing around and he used it too close to his body. And he killed himself. And
it was a similar situation to what happened with The Crow.
Yeah, and he was basically died. He was brain dead. And they tried to save the show and bring it back, but people, when you do that, if it's a long-running show and a main actor dies, you can sometimes get away with it because people love the show and they say, oh, we're going to still be loyal to you, and they're still going to try to produce it. And we understand, John Ritter died on a show and people still stuck with it and they just, worked on it. But this guy, well, it wasn't around long enough and it didn't have enough of a following. And it disappeared. It had to be canceled after a year.
Again, we're only talking about a few of his his highlights, and I'm sure there's tons more. He did stuff even before all these shows. He did a lot of work with Robert Wagner. He did It Takes a Thief and Switch. I remember, again, these are like syndicated shows that used to pop up on my TV when I was very young, and I'm like, what's this about? It's like, wow, all this stuff just, it's a person's entire career. It's their resume, being thrown at you here.
Well,
basically.
Look, he came back in the modern era, shall we say, because of things like the reimagining of Battlestar. They made attempts a couple times. They've made attempts to do Knight Rider again, both with Hasselhoff and with a whole new group. There was a lot of success, but it didn't really involve him, other than I guess he had ownership to some of these properties. And,
right, he still gets his name on the credits, based on blah, 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 that kind of stuff.
Caprica involved him as a consultant, but my guess is that was so he could get a little jack. And
kind of like how Stan Lee's name appears everywhere in movies, but he really doesn't do much.
A couple, what's his name? Roddenberry started to be like that in the newer Star Trek shows until he passed. So, hey, the man lived a long life. If you were hurt by his borrowing of things, well, maybe you're not as fond. But I think as a TV fan, just a general TV fan, especially people a little older than us and slightly younger than us, this was a guy that you were fond of, and it's too bad. Again, the guy lived a long life, but it's too bad that he's gone.
Again, if you are interested in finding a little more about these shows, the best place to find them is you look at your TV lands, your Me TVs, any type of oldie television stations that most of us have, on cable or accessible through the internet. That's where you're going to find this, because his material is all, syndication heaven. If you have access to syndicated television shows, this is the type of stuff that, you will notice, hey, that name sounds familiar. This guy keeps showing up, like we mentioned earlier. Some of these producers have such a huge track record, and he was one of them. And, unfortunately, some of these shows, I don't know personally if they meant a lot to them. Like, for example, we're big fans of Battlestar Galactica, not only the new one, but even the old one we love. And to us, they're a big deal. But for these type of producers, you got to remember, they're churning out so many shows, different kinds of shows, that it's kind of like, it's kind of weird, the fact that, they start a show and they move on to something else. Now, something like Galactica only lasted one season, so they, he never had a chance, I guess, to move on to something else from Galactica because it was already on its way out while it was cooking.
I think I would have to guess. I mean, I don't know. I haven't read a lot of his stuff in any interviews in his later years, but I would have to imagine shows like Galactica, especially because of the renaissance it received recently, Hardy Boys, Knight Rider, I would imagine he would be proud of them because they weren't bad shows and they still have a following.
Right.
Battlestar's up there with Star Trek as one of the, all-time favorites, especially sci-fi,
No, and that was his formula. In other words, it's not like he's the type of producer that grabs onto a show and stays with it for 10 years if it happens to be a 10-year type of show. It was kind of in his DNA that's how he would operate. He would start the show, get it running, make sure the right people were involved, and then he'd move on to create something new. I guess it's a certain way of doing business and making shows, that this way it keeps you fresh. You're always doing something different, and you're moving on to something else in case something fails. You're already working on three other, you have three things on the burner while the other ones are already started. It's a certain work ethic, I guess.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it took us his passing to actually, be able to examine a lot of his shows. And because some of his shows are not genre, like we mentioned before, they're shows that we never would have touched upon. But luckily, we hit, I think, at least three of the big ones. We hit Galactica, we hit $6 Million Man, and we hit Buck Rogers. So, now you guys hopefully know a little bit more about Glen Larson and his particular empire, if you will, of shows that are out there if you want. Again, cable channels, and most of the stuff, I'm pretty sure most of it is already, it's got to be on DVD or even Netflix.
Yeah,
you can find all this stuff.
I would recommend people who didn't really grow up in that era and are, at least intrigued, look on YouTube and look on some of the cable channels, because I think you'll be surprised with the stuff that's out there.
Well, again, thank you everybody for listening, and thank you, James, for joining me today, and we will see you here next time at GeekFest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Well, I'm not the kind to kiss and tell, but I've been seen with Farrah. I've never been with anything less than a 9. So fine, I've been on fire with Sally Field, gone fast with the girl named Bo, but somehow they just don't end up as mine. It's a death-defying life I lead. I take my chances. I die for living in the movies and TV. But the hardest thing I ever do is watch my leading ladies kiss some other guy while I'm bandaging my knee. I might fall from a tall building, I might roll a brand new car, 'cause I'm the unknown stuntman that made Redford such a star. I've never spent much time in school, but I taught ladies plenty. It's true, I hire my body out for pay. Hey, hey, I've gotten burned over Cheryl Teague's, blown up for Raquel Welch. But when I wind up in the hay, it's only hay. Hey, hey, I might jump an open drawbridge or Tarzan from a vine, 'cause I'm the unknown stuntman that makes Eastwood look so fine.
Oh, and this week, BJ mixes it up with the Lady Trucker. Man, what happened to me? I just lost my mind.